Hello, everyone. So we're going to continue our lecture on the history of the church through the Middle Ages. Today, we're going to shift our focus and look at the spread of Christianity into Russia. Just a reminder, so at the after the Great Schism of 1054, the Western Catholic Church, or in the sense the Catholic Church, split into two camps. The Western Catholic Church under the authority of the papacy, while the Eastern Church became more known as the Eastern Orthodox Church, which fell under the rule and the authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Um, uh, with uh, with that, the Eastern Orthodox Church was very closely tied to the Byzantine Empire, and so the Eastern Orthodox Church began to expand westward and northwards from Constantinople into different Slavic communities and groups where the Eastern Byzantine version of Christianity thrived. And it's like I said, surpassing those boundaries, those political boundaries of the Byzantine Empire. And so one of these regions is Russia. And the expansion of Christianity into Russia helped formulate the creation of the Russian Orthodox Church, and which has ever since been part of the Russian people and ethnicity. And the Russian Orthodox Church today is one of the larger and more substantial groups and powers within the Eastern Orthodox Church. So we're going to look at its development and its history here. So in the 10th century, Kiev was the most powerful and prosperous city in Russia. Now, Russia did not exist in this time period. It was broken up into different Slavic communities and different principalities and smaller kind of feudal land kingdoms ruled by different dukes and such. But leadership in the Kiev region, as well as other regions, was in the hands of the Rus. The Rus were descendants of Norsemen who were, Vikings who traveled up and down the Dnieper or Volga rivers, traveling and trading through these different Slavic communities, enslaving some, selling some as slaves into the Byzantine Empire. So the Rus were particularly passionate and fervent in regards to commerce and trading with the Byzantine Empire. Because of this contact with the Rus, with the Byzantines, it allowed for Christianity to filter back into this region, into these Slavic communities. The first church was built by Olga of Kiev, patron of the Russian Orthodox Church today, in 945. But really, Christianity blossoms under the reign of Prince Vladimir, who ruled from 980 to about 1015 AD. Prince Vladimir was the grandson of Olga, who founded the first church in 945. Prince Vladimir converts over to Christianity, but there's a unique story in which he invites Christianity to spread among his people. And so the way he does so is that he sends out or contacts to bring in four representatives from each of the four different major religions: Judaism, Islam, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism. And so he invites the delegates from these each. He's not impressed with Judaism and Islam, and he can't decide between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholicism. So he sends delegates to each of these, his own personal representatives to each of these, to assess which is the better Christianity to pick. The Byzantine form of worship in the Hagia Sophia left an indelible impression upon the delegates from who traveled to Constantinople, and so convinced Vladimir to adopt the Eastern Orthodox mode of religion. The Russians would always place a greater value in their visually stunning mode of worship than strict doctrinal orthodoxy or moral codes. It doesn't mean that there wasn't any, it just means there's a greater emphasis on the mode of worship than on doctrinal issues. In 988, so Prince Vladimir embraced Eastern Orthodoxy. The Patriarch of Constantinople instituted the office of the Bishop of Kiev to guide the Russian Church. So Vladimir began to closely tie himself to the Byzantine Empire. There's always, in this early phase stage of Christianity in Russia, there's an early close connections between the Russian Church, the Russian people, and the Byzantine Empire. Prince Vladimir marries Anna, who's the niece of Basil II of the Macedonian dynasty. He also invites from the Byzantine Empire monks to come spread Christianity and teach and help convert more and more of the Russian people over to Christianity. These Byzantine monks help translate the liturgy into Slavonic, so that way the liturgy can be conducted in the primary language of the Russian people. It's also during this time period that we see unique architecture begin to form for the Russian people. It's a distinctive Russian church architecture, which you see famously. It's those onion-shaped topped buildings, top church buildings. Prince Vladimir was not only converted to Christianity, but acted in Christian and supported Christian endeavors, such as developing a social service for the poor and the needy and the homeless. He also established Christian schools throughout the city as well as the regions. Now, after his death, unfortunately, his dozen sons purged Kiev into a civil war in which only one would be victorious, and that is Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav emerged victorious in 1036. Now, under Yaroslav's rule, Kiev begins to evolve itself and transform into an intellectual and artistic capital, and becomes kind of the intellectual heart of Russia. The Bible was translated into Slavonic as well. You see the arrival and the development of the monastic movement thanks to Antony and Theodosius. Antony founded the monastery of the Caves in 1051 outside of Kiev, and they championed the necessity of enduring suffering humbly for Christ's sake and renouncing retaliation. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church adhered very much closely to the Byzantine model and with worship, and sided with the Eastern Orthodox Church during the Great Schism of 1054. The monastic movement expanded, and in fact, even today, the monastic community remains a key part of the Russian Orthodox Church. It resulted from the 20 monastic monasteries that existed with Yaroslav to about 50 monasteries in around 1100 AD. There was other rise of other prominent figures. You have Hilarion of Kiev, who was the first native Russian metropolitan bishop of Kiev. He is known for different things. His most renowned work is Sermons on Law and Grace, which focuses on the distinctions between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the importance of history in God's divine plan. You also had Cyril of Turov. He was the bishop of Turov. He gained fame for his timeless sermons and prayers and letters. His spiritual presence resembled that of, or spiritual perspectives was similar to Augustine, in that that he really focused on God's omnipotent power and mercy and majesty, and the absolute hopelessness of a sinner who relies on the mercy of God, and that there can be no salvation without this divine mercy. Now, one of the most transformative periods of Russian history, especially the Kievan Rus, is the expansion of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol nomads were united by Genghis Khan and began his campaign of expansion into China and Central Asia and the Khorasan Empire. He sent a small kind of like reconnaissance and force, a raiding party into modern-day Iran and into the Caucasus Mountains regions and into Russia, And this force actually defeated the Russians at the Battle of the Khalkha River. Now, this wasn't the main Mongol army; it was just a small raiding force, but it would devastate the Russian forces. And as quickly as it came and left and returned back to Mongolia, the Mongols, though, would return in full force under Batu Khan in 1236. And this was massive force, devastated the Russian military, and conquered Kiev and wiped out its populace in 1240. So the Russian Kievan state completely collapsed into different principalities, and the Mongol force began to move into Central Europe, dividing itself into Poland, and only stopped in Hungary, thanks to the death of Ogadai Khan, who was the chief Khan of the Mongols at this time. Because of his death, all Mongol leadership had to return to elect a new Khan. So every invasion pretty much stopped at this point to help elect that new Khan. So the Mongols even though they ceased their expansion, continued to rule Russia. And so the Russians had to pay tribute to the Mongols from their northern cities, but everything kind of central and south of Russia, in Russia, was under the rule of the Mongols. This Mongol Canaanite that was called the Golden Horde, with its capital at Sarai, off the Caspian Sea. But those cities, Russian cities that were outside of Mongol control, maintained some relative level of independence, but they had to pay substantial tribute to the Mongols. With the destruction of Kiev, Orthodox believers frequently would reflect back on Kievan Russia as the golden age of Russian Christianity. But because of the Mongol conquest, it's going to have a shaping influence of moving the center of Russian Christianity from Kiev to Moscow, as we'll see later. There's further developments looking at other Slavic communities here for a second within Serbia. The Serbs also contributed significantly to the development of Eastern Orthodox Church. One of their primary principal figures is a man named Sava. He was a Serbian prince who was intrigued by the monastic life at the famous monastery at Mount Athos. It was the famous monastery in Greece. Supposedly no woman's allowed to enter, and to this day no woman has ever set foot on Mount Athos. Sava was drawn to the monastery after protests from his father, and his father trying to prevent him from going. He establishes the first Serbian community there at Mount Athos, known as Highlander. He even draws his own father to joining and leaving his throne and abdicating to join his son at this monastery. But because of that, the Kingdom of Serbia breaks into civil war. There's different factions, and because Serbia is in relation is kind of the dividing point between Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, the different sons vying for power are split between those two camps. And at one point, it seems that Western Catholicism would be dominating the dominant Christianity in Serbia until Sava returned. His father had died, and so he returned with his father's body. The interesting thing is that his father died 7 years before his return. And supposedly when they opened up the casket, his body was still, instead of smelling the death and decay, smelled of sweet smelling oil and myrrh. So signifying that his father had become a saint. So his father is known as Simeon the Myrrh Gusher. And because of Sava's presence with his father, he was able to reconcile his brothers and help in the civil war. So he becomes the first archbishop of Serbia in 1219. He's able to anoint his brother Stephen as the Orthodox king in 1220. He's perceived as a humble individual, very pious and serene and tranquil. His demeanor radiates the centrality of knowing Christ in his life and an authentic life. He plays a role in helping severing ties from the papacy, but Sava does pass away in 1236. He's considered a national hero of the Serbs. He's visited by both Jews and Catholics alike. He's so important to Serbian national identity, that the Ottoman Turks in 1595 exhume his body and burn it in an attempt to destroy and desecrate his memory and help obliterate his memory, but he's still such a key figure in Serbian history and spread of Eastern Orthodoxy and cementing Eastern Orthodoxy in Serbia. Now, shifting back to Russia, so after the destruction of Kiev, the Mongols, even though they're expanding this empire, did not seek to change or transform the religions of any lands that they conquered. The Mongols were primarily shamans. The Mongols, depending on which leader you look at and which region, either converted to Islam, some maintained shaman practices, some practiced forms of Buddhism or Confucianism, some even embraced Nestorian Christianity. So it all just really depends on which figure you look at. But regardless, the Mongols in most areas in different time periods, it always fluctuates, but generally speaking, had a toleration of other religions, allowed other religions to have their own particular practices. So because of this, it allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to continue to grow. So the Russian Orthodox Church became kind of a point of resistance against the Mongols and tied itself very closely to the Russian leaders. And so the church and the state in Russia is very, very close tied together and intertwined together because this Russian national identity against and collective defiance against the Mongols. And one such particular place was Novgorod, which was a northern Russian city. Novgorod became a bastion of Russian Christian civilization. It emerged as a significant stronghold. Upon the collapse of Kiev in 1240, Novgorod assumed the mantle of safeguarding Russia's national liberty and Orthodox faith. One of its most important figures was a man named Prince Alexander Nevsky. Nevsky was known as a great military leader. He defeated the Swedes at the Battle of Neva in 1240 and defeated the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Lake Peipus in 1242. Nevsky was able to broker a peace with the Mongols to maintain the level of independence while paying tribute to the Mongols to keep them away for long enough. But his most significant contribution was appointing and bestowing upon his son Daniel in 1270 the small village city town of Moscow, and forever beginning the groundwork for the formation and birth of Moscow being the central city of the Russian people. Grand Prince Ivan I was the eminent ruler of Moscow. And one of the things is that he draws the Metropolitan Bishop of Kiev, kind of the chief figure, not so much a patriarch in a sense, near the level of patriarch in the Orthodox Church. He convinces the Metropolitan Bishop of Kiev to move from Kiev to Moscow. And so Peter, the Metropolitan Bishop, resides now in Moscow. So the headquarters of the Eastern Orthodox Church is now moved and centralized in Moscow. So the church is now completely entrenched within Moscow's landscape. Now, the Russian Orthodox spiritual transformation found an influential figure in a man named Sergius of Radonezh. He was an ascetic who led a reclusive life, who had, similar to like many ascetics, had access to divine visions, performed miracles. He founded his own monastery at the Holy Trinity in 1340. Sergius played an important role for catalyzing the spread of Russian missionary monks who spread Russian Orthodox Church into the northern forests of Russia and Siberia and beyond. And converting the pagan inhabitants and establishing more monastic communities that branched out and connected together. The monastery of the Holy Trinity incubated a new powerful tradition of Russian art with the helps of men like Daniel Korny and Andrei Rublev. Their artwork began to proliferate. And one such particular artwork, for example, of Andrew Rublev's was the Holy Trinity the three angels, which is sometimes known as the Holy Trinity, or also it's the triad angels with Abraham, visiting Abraham, with the focus on the central angel here, which is personified as Christ, because the angel is wearing both red and blue, with the blue each color signifying his divine and human nature. Remember, icons, just like we talked about in our previous lecture on the Eastern Orthodox Church, played a significant role in Eastern Orthodox religion and liturgy. Icons held a venerated place in the Russian Orthodox Church, adorning everything from churches to peasant houses. Russians ascribed certain miracles and powers to different icons. So one particular icon, the icon of Our Lady of Vladimir, for example, supposedly helped repel 3 different foreign invasions of Moscow. So these monastic and ascetic leaders helped spread and encourage these different teachings and practices of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and more especially began to migrate from Greece and other lands of the Byzantine Empire to these Slavic communities as well, and helping to enhance the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Over time, the Golden Horde began to weaken its control over the Russian peoples and communities that it controlled and demanded tribute from. One in particular effect of this the cause of this weakening is a man named Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. Tamerlane is a kind of a Turk / Mongol, supposed descendant of Genghis Khan, who was a bandit turned into a ruling chief, and established his own Timurid empire in and around Iran. He was a brutal figure, massacred hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and it laid waste to a lot of the Middle East. Tamerlane defeated the Golden Horde, and his defeat of it helped cause it to break apart into different smaller regional Khanates. And so with the Golden Horde disintegrating, the Grand Prince Ivan III began to elevate and accrue sufficient political and military clout to cease having to pay tribute to the Mongols, and pretty much declaring full independence. In 1480, the Grand Prince Ivan III declares himself the ruler of Russia in 1480. And so with this, the Russian Orthodox Church emancipated itself from Mongol control and influence. It began to garner support. While this was taking place in the Byzantine Empire, what was left of the Byzantine Empire, the emperor began to seek support to help repel against the Ottoman Turks and to prevent further invasions, because pretty much the Byzantine Empire was just simply a few small regions plus Constantinople. And the Ottoman Turks looked poised to conquering the city. To help gain support and military defense against the Ottoman Turks, the patriarch as well as the emperor seek to gain support of the papacy and agreed to place the Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of the papacy. This was developed in the Union of Florence in 1439. In response to that, in 1448, a Russian council of bishops united together to in turn elect their own metropolitan bishop, instead of having one coordinated and worked with the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Union of Florence never really worked out. The people opposed it, and it ended up the Patriarch was kind of forced to abandon it. But because of this, the Russian Church, with their election of their own metropolitan bishop, were declared autocephalous, which means that they were independent of the Patriarch of Constantinople. They're their own Orthodox Church, even though, yes, they are a part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The metropolitan bishop of the Patriarch of Moscow, in a sense, does not have to answer to, but is on equal terms with the Patriarch of Constantinople. So this is a huge step forward. with the enhancement of the Russian Orthodox Church as a leader of within the Eastern Orthodoxy as a whole. There's some development of religious dissent in this time period. You have two different groups that appear within the Russian Orthodox Church. You have the Strigal-Niki, which were a group that originally protested simony and protested certain ecclesiastical corruptions, but then began to grow into denying the resurrection and other heretical teachings. You also have the rise of Gnostic groups like the Judaizers, which are some debate of exactly what they believed. They followed some sort of Gnostic teachings. But ultimately, what this developed into was a view of how we should deal with heretical groups, because Russians had debate whether or not they should be persecuted out of existence or simply defeated in arguments and persuaded to return back into the faith, back into the Russian Orthodox Church. So one of the most critical moments that transformed Eastern Orthodoxy, and we'll look about this in a different lecture too, especially the consequence of it, is the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. With the fall of the city, the spiritual capital of the Orthodoxy, in a sense, moves from Byzantium or moves from Constantinople to Moscow. And there's some critical transformations that help that shift to take place. One, besides, is the fall of Constantinople itself, is that Ivan III marries Sophia, who was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI. So tying himself and tying the line of the Russian leaders, not czars just yet, into tying them with the old Caesars of the past. They also began to adopt the Roman symbol of the double eagle, the Byzantine symbol of the double eagle within their standard. And then finally, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible or the Awesome, assumes the title of emperor, or in this case, czar, and similar to the term Caesar. And so as czar of all of Rus, as czar of all the Russians, and uses similar Byzantine coronation ceremonies. So now the center of orthodoxy begins to move from Constantinople to Moscow. It becomes the central spiritual center. And Russians see this taking place as history, as in the sense that Rome was a spiritual capital, then it moved to Constantinople, and then it moved now to Moscow. That Moscow is now the third Rome in a sense, and that it sees itself in God's divine plan through history as part of as God's chosen land. It preserves the Christian faith from Rome and Byzantium, and that it's keeping itself from heretical teachings and falling back into Western Catholicism or Protestantism. It's the stand guard as a guardian of Christ and apostles' teachings. But what we see and what you'll see later on in Russian Orthodox Church is that, like I said, it's very closely tied, more so than in the sense what the Byzantine Empire had with the Russian state, especially when we look like Tsar Peter the Great. The Russian Orthodox Church is pretty much subsumed into the state control. And the Russian Orthodox Church, in many different ways, has been under state control ever since. But that doesn't deny itself its sense of its viewpoint of being the divine mission and destiny for the Russian people as a whole. Well, thank you guys for joining us for today's lecture and reviewing the development of Orthodox Church in Russia. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Hopefully I'll see you soon for future lectures on the history of the church through the Middle Ages.